Lavish bedroom late at night, rain tapping against the window. He tosses the divorce papers onto the table, eyes cold, not a flicker of hesitation. Sign it. Don't waste any more of my time. She, one hand cradling her 8-month belly, the other gripping the trembling papers, lifts her gaze and looks him dead in the eyes. You really don't want to know if this baby is a boy or a girl. He turns and walks away. No hesitation. Tosses one line back over his shoulder. I already have the person I need. You have nothing to do with me anymore. The door slams shut. 3 months later, the man stands frozen in the doorway of the hospital room, staring at the woman he once left behind, cradling a newborn in her arms, lips curved into a quiet smile as if he had never existed in her life at all. For the first time, the man who commands an entire empire doesn't know how to say a single word. This is where the real story begins. Hit follow so you don't miss a single episode. He served his pregnant wife divorce papers. Then her baby activated the 22% clause hook. At 34 weeks pregnant, Sloane Harlow was handed divorce papers in the marble lobby of her husband's company, just as he stepped out of the elevator with his mistress at his side. Cade Harlow believed an amended agreement had stripped Sloane of every claim to his empire. He believed the divorce would be clean, private, and finished before the baby could complicate anything. What he did not know was that the amendment had never been signed, and by filing first while his wife was still pregnant, Cade had activated a clause written by his own father. If their child was born alive before the divorce became final, 22% of Harlow capital would leave Cade's control. Sloane had known for 31 days. She only needed him to make the first move, the cheap envelope. The envelope was cheap. That was the first thing Sloane noticed. Cream-colored, standard weight. Her full name typed across the front in a plain black font, Sloane Morgan Harlow. No handwriting, no Harlow capital letterhead, no trace of the precision Cade usually demanded from anything carrying his name. A paralegal Sloane did not recognize had pressed it into her hands at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning in the lobby of Harlow Capital's Manhattan headquarters. Mr. Foster's office said you were collecting marital documents here after your appointment, the young woman murmured. I was told to give these directly to you. Then she turned toward the elevator bank before Sloane could ask what kind of documents required hand delivery. The lobby rose around her in glass, marble, and brushed steel. 40 feet of calculated coldness designed to make every visitor feel smaller than the building, and every employee feel fortunate to belong inside it. Sloane stood beneath the suspended silver logo with her coat open over her 34-week belly and understood what the envelope contained before she broke the seal. She had been married to Cade Harlow for 5 years. He would not send a paralegal to deliver anything kind. She opened it anyway. The papers were folded into thirds, petition for dissolution of marriage. The petitioner's name appeared first, Cade Elliott Harlow. Sloane read the opening paragraph once. She did not need to read further. She knew the proposed terms already because she had spent the past month studying the documents Cade believed governed their marriage. She folded the petition along its original creases and slid it into the leather portfolio she carried everywhere. The portfolio contained 22 pages Cade had forgotten, 9 pages he believed had replaced them, and 1 blank signature line capable of destroying the future he had arranged for himself. Behind her, the elevator chimed. Sloane did not turn immediately. She gave herself 3 seconds. 5 years with Cade had taught her that the first expression people saw was the one they remembered. Cade read rooms for weakness. He collected reactions and used them later as evidence. By the time Sloane turned, her face was calm. Cade was crossing the lobby with Petra Voss beside him. He wore a charcoal suit without a tie, the look his public relations team called accessible CEO. Sloane had always thought it made him look like a man performing the idea of relaxation. Petra was tall, pale, and exact in a navy coat cut close to her body. She was a New York licensed securities attorney and the outside capital markets advisor Cade had brought into Harlow Capital 8 months earlier. Her hand did not quite hold Cade's arm. It grazed it lightly, suggesting intimacy without admitting to it. Petra saw Sloane first. Sloane, she said with enough warmth to make the word insulting. I didn't know you were coming in today. Cade stopped several feet away. His attention moved from Sloane's face to the envelope, then to the portfolio at her hip. The lawyers were supposed to handle this privately, he said. He was not apologizing for the petition. He was annoyed that the delivery had placed all 3 of them in the same room. The lobby had gone quiet. A security guard stood behind the desk. 2 assistants waited near the elevators. 4 junior analysts had suddenly become fascinated by their phones, although Sloane recognized 2 of them well enough to know they were reading nothing. She had worked in this building for 3 years before Cade persuaded her to leave her own career and become the wife who appeared at dinners, corrected his speeches, remembered the names of investors' children, and made his ambition look like stability. Now some of the same employees were watching him serve his pregnant wife divorce papers while standing beside another woman. Cade had not planned that. Sloan could see him calculating whether retreating would look worse than continuing. He continued. Foster will contact you about the proposed terms, he said. Foster can contact Anara Webb. The name changed his expression by less than an inch. It was enough. Anara Webb meant nothing to him yet. By that evening, it would mean 20 years of family law, corporate governance, and contested trust work. It would mean a woman who took cases wealthy men believed were already decided. Cade looked at Sloane's belly and then back at her face. The filing doesn't need to become hostile. No, Sloane said. It only needs to remain filed. Petra's gaze sharpened. Cade did not understand the sentence. Sloane adjusted the strap of her portfolio and nodded once, not to him, but to the empty space between them, as if acknowledging the completion of a transaction. Then she walked toward the revolving door. She did not hurry. Hurrying would have looked like fleeing. She was not fleeing. She was letting the clock begin. Before the marriage became a brand, there had been a time when Sloane entered Harlow Capital through the employee doors rather than the revolving entrance reserved for visitors and executives. She had been 29 then, a senior analyst at a restructuring firm that advised companies wealthy enough to disguise panic as strategy. Harlow Capital was one of her clients. Cade was not yet chief executive. He was the founder's son with a talent for numbers, a weakness for praise, and the restless energy of a man who believed every room was secretly deciding whether he deserved to remain in it. They met during a 12-hour negotiation over a failing logistics company in Ohio. Cade had proposed protecting the parent company by stripping the subsidiary and forcing the lenders to absorb the loss. Sloane had pointed out that the plan would save the quarter and destroy every future negotiation with the same banks. He had stared at her across the conference table. Most people softened disagreement with Cade. They praised the ambition first, apologized for the objections second, and left him enough space to believe the correction had been his idea. Sloane did none of those things. Your plan is mathematically elegant, she told him. It is also strategically expensive. Cade had asked her to explain. She did. 3 hours later, he used her structure in the final proposal and gave her credit in front of his father. Their first date happened 2 weeks afterward at a restaurant neither of them could afford, without pretending the price did not matter. Cade arrived 40 minutes late because his father had collapsed during a board dinner. He did not explain until midnight, after the kitchen had closed, and the waiter had stopped attempting to move them toward the door. I thought if I told you it would sound like an excuse, he said. It is an explanation. I don't like needing those. Everyone needs them. The problem is when explanations become permission. He smiled then, not the controlled expression he later used for magazine covers, but a surprised, unguarded smile that made him look younger than he was. I'm going to have to pay attention around you, he said. You should pay attention around everyone. For the first 2 years, he did. He asked her opinion before board presentations. He listened when she said an acquisition target had hidden liabilities. He called from airports, because hearing her describe ordinary things, the broken elevator in her building, the woman at the bakery, who always gave her the wrong coffee made the ambitions surrounding him feel less absolute. When Cade's father died, Sloane stood beside him through the funeral, the succession fight, and the 6 months in which every director who had promised loyalty began quietly testing how much pressure the son could withstand. She helped Cade prepare for those rooms. She did not write his decisions for him, but she showed him where the weaknesses were. When he won the permanent chief executive appointment, the press described Sloane as the calming influence behind a brilliant air. The description irritated her. Cade said it was only language. Later, he asked whether she truly needed to keep working with companies that competed against Harlow Capital. It was framed as a conflict of interest question. Then it became a scheduling question. Then a question about the kind of family they wanted. Sloane left her firm 6 months after the wedding. Cade promised she could return whenever she chose. The promise was sincere when he made it. That was what made the later years difficult to explain. Cade did not transform from loving husband to indifferent one in a single decision. He changed through a sequence of reasonable requests whose total cost was visible only after Sloane had paid it. Attend this dinner because the investor trusts you. Cancel that trip because the board vote is close. Do not challenge me in front of Marcus. Tell me afterward. Do not tell me afterward when I am already exhausted. The company needs stability. The public needs confidence. Why does every conversation have to become an argument? By the 4th year, Sloane had become essential to Cade's image and increasingly irrelevant to his choices. Their first pregnancy ended at 11 weeks. Cade held her hand in the hospital. He stayed through the procedure. He drove them home himself and made tea he forgot to bring upstairs. The following morning, he took a call from London in the kitchen. The loss was never discussed again. Sloane had told herself that people grieved differently. It was true. She used the truth to protect him from a second truth. Cade survived pain by converting it into work, and he expected everyone near him to disappear from the emotional landscape until he was ready to look again. When Sloane became pregnant a second time, Cade kissed her forehead and asked the doctor for survival statistics before he asked Sloane how she felt. By the 5th month, he was sleeping in the Greenwich guest room 3 nights a week because early calls made it more practical. By the 6th, Petrovas's name had begun appearing in messages after midnight. By the 7th, Cade stopped turning his phone face down because concealment had become less important than the confidence that Sloane would not confront him. She had not confronted him. She had been collecting facts. The cheap envelope in the lobby was not the moment her marriage ended. It was merely the first time Cade put the ending in writing. The clause Cade forgot. The town car waited on 6th Avenue, double-parked beneath a gray November sky. Sloane got into the rear seat, placed the portfolio beside her, and waited until the car moved before unzipping the inner compartment. The original prenuptial agreement lay beneath a blue tab. 5 years earlier, before Harlow Capital's public offering and before Cade's net worth gained 8 zeros, Cade's father had insisted that the marriage be governed by a detailed agreement. Most of it protected Cade. One section did not. Section 14's, titled Founders Family Continuity Covenant, incorporated a voting share escrow created in 2003 by Cade's father. 22% of Harlow Capital holdings had been placed in a conditional escrow when Cade became the founder's successor. Cade controlled the voting rights while the condition remained unmet, but he did not possess an absolute right to keep the shares under every circumstance. The covenant was narrow. If Cade initiated a divorce while his lawful wife was pregnant with his biological child, and that child was born alive before the marriage was legally dissolved, 11% of the holding company would vest in the wife, and 11% would transfer into a custodial trust for the child. The clause was not a reward for childbirth. It was a restraint on abandonment. Cade's father had designed it after watching another wealthy family remove a pregnant wife, rewrite succession documents, and spend years fighting over a child whose future had been treated as a liability. The clause could be waived, but only through a written waiver personally signed by the wife, reviewed by independent counsel chosen by her, and accepted by the escrow trustee before the husband filed for divorce. The 9-page post-nuptial amendment beneath the red tab had been designed to serve as that waiver. It was dated September 14th. The notarization page was dated October 2nd. Sloane's signature line was blank. There was no certificate from independent counsel. There was no acceptance from the escrow trustee. There was only a notary stamp placed beneath a name that had never been signed. Cade believed the amendment was complete. Petra believed it was complete. Foster, Cade's lead attorney, had treated it as complete. Sloane had discovered otherwise 31 days earlier. She had requested the executed copy 6 days before finding it, relying on a review provision in the original prenup. Cade's legal team sent the file without noticing the blank line because the amendment had already been scanned, indexed, and labeled ECUDED. Sloane found the error at 11 o'clock at night in the home office she was no longer supposed to use. She had stared at the page for several minutes. Then she called Anara Webb. Anara had read the agreement in silence and asked one question. Has he filed? No. Then do nothing. That answer had frightened Sloane more than urgency would have. Anara explained that warning Cade would allow him to correct the waiver or delay the divorce until after the birth. Filing first was the act that placed him inside the covenant. Once the petition was pending, the birth of the child before final judgment would complete the trigger. Sloane could not force Cade to file. She could only allow him to believe he was safe enough to do it. The witnesses in the lobby were not legally necessary. The court filing spoke for itself. But the witnesses would make it harder for Cade to later call the separation mutual, private, or misunderstood. They would also matter to a board already sensitive to the difference between personal failure and reputational recklessness. 31 days earlier, the night Sloane found the blank signature line, rain had been striking the Greenwich windows hard enough to sound like thrown gravel. Cade was at a capital markets dinner in Midtown. He had told her not to wait up. Petra's name appeared twice on the public guest list, and once in a message that flashed across Cade's tablet while Sloane was looking for a charger. Private room confirmed. I moved Warren beside you. We'll discuss the family issue after dessert. Sloane had read the message without touching it. The phrase family issue stayed with her. At 11, she entered the home office and opened the digital file Foster's assistant had sent that afternoon. She had requested every marital agreement bearing her name after noticing a charge from the outside law firm labeled execution coordination. The postnuptial amendment was 9 pages long. It described the 22% covenant as an outdated restraint, acknowledged that both parties had received independent advice, and stated that Sloane voluntarily waived any interest arising from Cade's initiation of dissolution during pregnancy. The language was clinical enough to disguise its intention. Sloane read each page twice. She had never seen the document. She had never discussed a waiver. She had never retained independent counsel. On page 9, a notary certified that Sloan Morgan Harlow had personally appeared on October 2nd and acknowledged signing the instrument. The signature line above the certificate was empty. Sloan opened the metadata. The file had been scanned on October 5th and relabeled Final Executed. She downloaded a copy to an encrypted drive, photographed every screen with her phone, and printed the document on the office printer. Only after the pages were inside her portfolio did she allow herself to sit down. She had been in New York Presbyterian on October 2nd. The admission bracelet remained in the top drawer of her bedside table because she had not yet decided whether keeping it was sentimental or merely evidence that something frightening had happened. Cade had been in San Francisco. Petra had sent flowers to the hospital under the name Harlow Capital Executive Office. Sloan remembered the card because the message had been oddly formal, wishing you stability and a smooth recovery. At 11:26, Sloan called a former colleague named Rachel Yin, who had once used Anara Web during a divorce involving a private equity partnership. Rachel did not ask why Sloan needed the number. She sent it within 30 seconds. Anara answered her own emergency line. I need to know whether a document can be valid when the person supposedly signing it has never seen it, Sloan said. Anara's voice became immediately alert. Do not describe more by phone. Are you safe where you are? Yes. Does your husband know you found it? No. Keep it that way. Photograph the original source, preserve the email transmitting it, and do not alter the file. Come to my office at 8. Sloan arrived the next morning carrying the portfolio and a list of dates. Anara's office contained no dramatic view, no awards displayed at eye level, and no furniture chosen to make clients feel grateful. There were comfortable chairs, natural light, and a conference table scarred in one corner by years of use. Anara read the prenup first, then the amendment, then the hospital records. She did not congratulate Sloan on finding the defect. She did not call it a victory. She asked whether Cade knew the sex of the baby. Does he know the exact due date? He knows the month. Has he threatened divorce? Not directly. Foster sent a proposed financial disclosure authorization last week. Cade says it is estate planning. It is probably divorce preparation. Sloan nodded. She had known that before walking in. Anara placed the documents in 3 parallel stacks. The waiver fails on at least 3 independent grounds, she said. No signature, no independent counsel, no trustee acceptance. But that does not mean you are protected yet. Why not? Because the continuity covenant has 2 triggering events. Cade must file while you are pregnant. The child must be born before final judgment. At present, neither has happened. He could wait until after the birth.
Yes.
Or correct the amendment.
Yes.
Sloan looked at the blank line. What happens if I confront him? He learns what needs repairing. What happens if I file first? The covenant never triggers. It is written to restrain his conduct, not yours. The answer produced a strange stillness in Sloan. She had spent months imagining that taking action meant initiating the divorce herself. Now, the most effective action was restraint. I have to let him leave me. No, Anara said. He is already leaving you. You have to avoid interrupting him before he documents the choice. The distinction mattered. Anara outlined the plan. Sloan would secure housing, medical privacy, bank access, and copies of every relevant agreement. She would not sign new documents. She would not reveal the missing signature. She would not provoke a filing, because manufacturing the trigger could invite an accusation of bad faith. She would simply stop preventing Cade from doing what he intended. And if the baby comes early, Sloan asked, then the timeline compresses. Once he files, every day the divorce remains pending protects the possibility of the transfer. We can ensure no judgment is entered without full review. And if something happens to her? Anara's expression softened for the first time. Then none of this will matter in the way you currently think it matters. Sloan looked down at her hands. The legal strategy and the pregnancy occupied the same body, but they could not be allowed to become the same thing. Her daughter was not a conditioned precedent. She was a child Sloan wanted before she understood how much wanting could frighten her. I need you to promise me something, Sloan said. What? If there is a medical decision, the case waits. Of course. No filing, no share transfer, nothing happens before she is safe. Anara held her gaze. I represent you. That includes the part of you that is her mother. For the first time since finding the amendment, Sloan breathed fully. They spent the next 4 hours constructing a timeline. When Sloan left, Anara kept certified copies in a fireproof cabinet. Sloan kept the originals in the leather portfolio. 31 days later, Cade placed the petition into her hands. He believed he was choosing the date of her defeat. He had no idea she had been waiting for the date to exist. Sloan took out her phone and called Anara. Anara answered on the second ring. It's done, Sloan said. He filed. I was served in the lobby. Petra was with him. Was the petition stamped? Yes. Today. Anara exhaled once. Good. It was not a celebratory word. It was the word used when an unpleasant event had occurred in the exact form required to become useful. There were witnesses, Sloan added. Better. Start the clock. I already have. Sloan ended the call and placed one hand over the curve of her stomach. Her daughter moved slowly beneath her palm. 5 weeks until the due date. The divorce could not be completed that quickly, especially once Anara entered the case. Cade had believed serving the petition was the beginning of Sloan's removal. In reality, it was the first signature on his own loss. The apartment on West 81st, the apartment had become Sloan's contingency plan before it became her home. Anara's firm maintained 3 furnished units for clients whose safety, privacy, or litigation strategy required distance. The West 81st Street apartment was the least polished of them. 2 bedrooms, narrow pre-war hallways, radiators that clanked at night, and windows overlooking the brick wall of a neighboring building. Sloan chose it because it was ordinary. The Greenwich house had required staff, deliveries, security logs, landscapers, drivers, and a gate that recorded every vehicle. Privacy, there was an illusion maintained by people paid to observe discreetly. On West 81st, no one cared who entered as long as they did not block the stairs. Sloan moved 4 suitcases, her grandmother's cast-iron skillet, 3 boxes of books, and the leather portfolio. She left behind most of the clothes Cade had purchased for public appearances. She left the wedding china, the art chosen by a consultant, and the silver frames containing photographs of a marriage already edited for display. She took 1 photograph from the bedroom. It showed Cade at 32, sitting on the floor of their first apartment with takeout containers around him and a legal pad balanced on one knee. He was laughing because Sloan had just informed him that his handwritten projections were wrong by $14 million. She did not take the photograph because she wanted him back. She took it because she needed evidence that the person she had loved had existed, even if he no longer did in a form she could live beside. The first night alone, the radiator woke her at 2:10. She lay in the unfamiliar bed with one hand over her stomach and listened to pipes complain through the walls. At 2:24, Cade sent a message. I assume Anara advised you to leave. Foster will coordinate access to anything you forgot. There was no question about her health, no question about where she was, no request to discuss the child. Sloan typed 3 responses and deleted them all. Finally, she wrote, please direct legal matters to Anara. For medical emergencies involving the baby, I will contact you directly. Cade replied with a single word, understood. Sloan stared at it until the screen darkened. That was how 5 years of marriage became a protocol. During the days that followed, she built routines small enough to trust. She walked in Central Park each morning. She bought groceries from a market where no one knew her name. She attended appointments without a driver carrying the Harlow logo on his phone. She learned which floorboard near the kitchen creaked and which radiator valve needed to be turned halfway to stop the banging. The second bedroom became Eleanor's room, though almost nothing in it was ready. A bassinet remained boxed against the wall. 2 folded blankets sat on a chair. Sloan had avoided decorating because Cade had called preparation before 36 weeks superstitious after the first loss. Now she understood that his superstition had become another rule governing what she was permitted to hope for. She opened the box herself. It took 40 minutes to assemble the bassinet and another 20 to discover that one piece had been installed backward. When she finished, she stood in the center of the small room and imagined a child sleeping there. The image hurt because it mattered. Sloan allowed it to remain. The woman who had already moved in 3 days later, photographs of Cade and Petra appeared on a gossip account with 2 million followers. Cade leaving Nobu with his hand at Petra's lower back. Petra in the passenger seat of his G-Wagon outside the Greenwich house. Both of them at a Chelsea gallery opening, standing beneath white lights, with the practiced distance of people who wanted to be photographed denying what the photograph already proved. The caption read, Harlow Capital's Golden Boy finally trading up. By 7:43 Thursday morning, it had 11,000 comments. Sloan saw the post while standing at the kitchen counter of a 2-bedroom apartment on West 81st Street. She had moved out of the Greenwich house 3 weeks earlier, after Cade's late nights became an arrangement neither of them had named. The apartment belonged to Anara's firm and was used for clients who needed temporary privacy. Cade's lawyers knew Sloan had left the marital residence. They did not know where she was. Sloan read the comments for 90 seconds, then turned the phone face down and ate her toast cold. At 10, she walked to Anara's office carrying the leather portfolio beneath her arm. Anara was already seated at the conference table with 2 coffees, a legal pad, and a printed copy of the Gossip Post. Petra's publicist paid for placement with 3 outlets, Anara said. The photographs were distributed to the press and to selected members of the Harlow board. Not Cade? Not directly. Sloan sat down. She's building a separate relationship with the board. Yes, she wants a seat. Anara slid a second document across the table. It summarized 6 months of meeting records, consulting invoices, and calendar entries. Petra has been lobbying for an expansion of the advisory board. One external strategy seat, one capital market seat. The second seat is for her. That appears to be the plan. Sloan studied the dates. Petra's interest in Harlow Capital had begun before Cade's affair with her. That did not prove anything by itself. Ambitious people often approach powerful men through business before approaching them through desire. But Petra had first asked questions about Harlow family governance 8 months earlier. She had requested background on founder-controlled voting interests. She had attended 2 legal strategy meetings without a formal title. And 3 weeks before Cade told Marcus Lyle about the post-nuptial amendment, Petra had already referred to it in an email. Sloan looked up. She knew about Section 14 before Cade filed. We believe she knew before the amendment was drafted, Anara said. We do not yet know how. Then we don't accuse her. No, we let her keep moving. Anara watched Sloan for a moment. You understand that letting her move may mean letting her embarrass you publicly. She has already done that. She may do more. Sloan looked down at the post showing Petra seated in the passenger side of the car Sloan had chosen with Cade 2 years earlier. She thinks quiet means unprepared, Sloan said. Let her keep thinking it. Petra's calculation, Petra Voss had not built her career by entering rooms unprepared. She grew up in a 2-bedroom condominium in Queens with a mother who balanced insurance claims at the kitchen table and a father who sold commercial lighting until the company replaced half its sales force with software. Petra learned early that competence was admired only after it became impossible to ignore, and that people with inherited access called ambition unattractive when it arrived in someone they had not invited. At 38, she had a law degree from Columbia, a securities practice she had left before partnership, and a reputation for helping founder-controlled companies survive moments when private family arrangements became public corporate problems. She also had no permanent seat anywhere. Boards hired her during crises, praised her discipline, used her presentations, and returned her to the perimeter once stability resumed. Men with fewer qualifications were invited to remain because they resembled continuity. Petra was described as sharp, useful, formidable, and difficult, all words that meant the room wanted her labor without having to accommodate her authority. Harlow Capital appeared on her radar during a governance review for one of its lenders. The company looked simple from a distance, a public investment platform controlled through a private holding structure, with Cade Harlow exercising founder family voting rights inherited from his father. The deeper Petra looked, the more interesting the structure became. 22% of the voting interest sat in a conditional escrow. Public disclosures described it only as a family continuity arrangement. The percentages were large enough to affect any contested board vote and vague enough to invite questions. Petra asked one of the founder's former paralegals whether the arrangement was tied to death, incapacity, or succession. The paralegal should not have answered. He told her it involved marriage and children. Petra bought him lunch a week later. By the end of the meal, she knew Section 14 existed. She did not yet know its exact language, but she understood the vulnerability. Cade's control depended partly on conduct inside a marriage that was already unstable. Petra first met Cade formally at a capital markets summit in Boston. He spoke on a panel about founder discipline and long-term stewardship. His answers were polished, intelligent, and slightly too fast. Petra recognized the pattern. Cade prepared for objections before people made them because he experienced disagreement as exposure. After the panel, she asked why Harlow Capital had not modernized the voting structure inherited from his father. Cade's attention sharpened. Most people praised his stewardship. Petra questioned its architecture. He invited her to New York for a consulting discussion. Their first 6 meetings were entirely professional. Petra identified weaknesses in Harlow's debt covenants, improved the sequencing of a board presentation, and warned Cade that Warren Cresswell had begun holding private calls with independent directors. Cade valued information that made him feel less surprised. Petra supplied it. The personal relationship developed through increments neither of them named. A drink after a meeting because the restaurant was downstairs. A car to Greenwich because her hotel was on the route. A message after midnight about a board memo that became a conversation about Cade's father. Cade described Sloan as intelligent but emotionally distant. Petra understood that emotionally distant often meant a wife had stopped doing emotional labor without being asked. She did not say so. Instead, she told Cade it must be exhausting to carry responsibility no one around him fully understood. That sentence opened more access than any legal analysis she had prepared. By the time the affair began, Petra already knew about the pregnancy, the weak marriage, and the continuity covenant. She also knew Cade did not understand the covenant's operational detail. His father's lawyers had treated it as an inherited nuisance. Cade believed the family documents existed to protect him because nearly all of them did. Petra suggested a governance review. Foster's junior team produced the original prenup. When Cade finally read Section 14A, he reacted exactly as Petra expected. My father wrote a penalty for divorcing my wife. He wrote a control mechanism, Petra corrected. It can be waived. Sloan will never sign it if she knows I'm leaving. She does not need to know every future possibility. The amendment can be presented as a state modernization before the birth. Cade looked uncomfortable. Petra did not push immediately. She waited 3 days and returned with a draft that emphasized tax efficiency, succession clarity, and mutual waiver of contingent interests. She explained that independent counsel could be arranged as a procedural formality. Cade approved the approach. Petra told herself she was protecting the company from a provision written by a dead founder who had confused morality with governance. She did not examine why the elimination of Sloan's interest also made Petra's future position easier. People rarely describe their own ambition as appetite. They called it alignment, efficiency, or readiness. When Sloan was hospitalized, the execution process stalled. Foster was in London. The senior associate responsible for the file was preparing for trial. Petra coordinated with junior staff, insisting the amendment be completed before the next trustee review. The associate went to the hospital and failed to find Sloan. Petra received a message asking whether separate execution had been arranged. She replied, confirmed. Complete the notary block and hold pending final signature. Timing is critical. She expected the signature to be collected later. 3 days afterward, Dex Fontaine sent a scanned version labeled Final Executed. Petra opened the first page, checked the document name, and forwarded it to Cade. She did not scroll to page 9. That omission was not the result of carelessness alone. It came from confidence, the most expensive state of mind in any transaction. Once Cade believed the waiver was complete, Petra began encouraging him to resolve the marriage before the child's birth. A public separation would be unpleasant, but controllable. It would also make Cade more dependent on the person guiding him through the board's reaction. Petra did not think of herself as stealing another woman's husband. She thought Sloan had already withdrawn from a role Petra was better equipped to perform. The distinction allowed her to sleep. The photographs were meant to accelerate acceptance. The advisory board proposal was meant to formalize what Petra believed she had earned. When she saw Sloan standing in the lobby with the petition, Petra noticed 3 things. Sloan was not surprised. The leather portfolio was too full to contain only medical papers. And when Sloan said it only needs to remain filed, she was not speaking emotionally. Petra understood risk for a living. For one brief second, she felt it. Then Cade looked embarrassed, the employees looked fascinated, and Petra decided Sloan's composure was merely pride. It was the conclusion Petra needed, so she accepted it without testing it. The first crack that same morning in Greenwich, Marcus Lyle sat across from Cade in the home office overlooking the garden Sloan had planted. Marcus had served as Harlow Capital's chief financial officer for 11 years. He was 63, broad-shouldered, economical with language, and almost impossible to impress. Cade trusted him because Marcus delivered bad news without adding theater. Marcus opened a file. The postnuptial amendment, he said. I have a question about the execution copy. Cade leaned back. What question? The signature page contains a notarization block, but no signature from Sloan. Cade's expression did not change, but his hand stopped moving over the arm of the chair. Foster's team handled execution. I know. Then ask Foster. I intend to. Marcus closed the file. It may be a scanning error. He said it in the tone of a man who did not believe in scanning errors until he had seen the original paper. Verify it, Cade said. Do not include it in the marital asset schedule until Foster confirms. Marcus stood. One more thing. The notarization date falls during the week Sloan was hospitalized. Cade looked at him. What hospitalization? Marcus waited half a second before answering. New York Presbyterian, elevated blood pressure, and early contractions. September 30th through October 6th. Cade had known she had gone to the hospital. He had believed it was overnight monitoring. He had been in San Francisco closing a transaction. Petra had told him Sloan was stable and did not want him to interrupt the trip. Sloan had sent him one message. The baby is okay. Finish what you need to finish. He had read it as permission. Now, for the first time, he wondered whether it had been resignation. Send everything to Foster, he said. Marcus left. Cade remained at the desk looking through the window at the November garden. The beds done brown. Sloan had once described the bare geometry of winter as honest. He had not understood what she meant. Petra arrived at noon wearing a cream sweater and carrying lunch. She moved through the kitchen with the comfort of someone rehearsing ownership bag on the island, coat over the chair, hand inside the refrigerator without asking. While they ate, she described the positive response to the photographs. Warren Cresswell called it a period of personal transition, she said. He's more open to the advisory board expansion now. Cade set down his fork. What expansion? Petra's pause was small. The 2 seats we discussed. We did not discuss 2 seats. I mentioned them. You presented them as a general governance idea. One of the seats should go to a capital market specialist, and you believe that should be you. I have been useful to this company for 8 months without a title. Petra met his eyes. Let me have one. For the first time since their affair began, Cade did not see her confidence as an extension of his own power. He saw a separate plan moving beside him. Let me think about it, he said. Petra nodded, as though he had agreed. The file no one wanted to own. Marcus did not send the amendment directly back to Foster. First, he made a copy of the routing sheet and compared the document identifiers against Harlow Capital's payment records. The invoice described 12 hours of execution support, independent counsel coordination, trustee correspondence, and final certification. Marcus could find no invoice from independent counsel representing Sloan. He could find no trustee correspondence accepting the waiver. He called Foster from his car. Who represented Sloan on the postnup? There was a pause. I would need to check the file. The agreement states that she received independent advice. Yes. From whom? I said I need to check. Marcus had worked with attorneys long enough to distinguish missing memory from delayed alarm. Do not correct the file before I see the original, he said. That is an unusual instruction from a CFO. It is an unusual document. The original file arrived from the outside firm by messenger at 6:20 that evening. Marcus opened it in a conference room with the head of internal audit present. The folder was thinner than the billed work suggested. There was a draft, an approval email from Cade, a hospital appointment note, the blank signature page, and a printed message from Petra instructing the junior team to treat the matter as time-sensitive. No engagement letter for Sloan's counsel, no written waiver from Sloan, no trustee acceptance, no completed signature. The internal audit director looked at Marcus. Should legal be here? Legal created the file. That is not an answer. It is why the answer is no, not yet. Marcus photographed the folder and locked it in the audit safe. At 7:05, he called Gideon Park, whom he had known since a contested estate matter involving his own brother. Gideon listened to the outline and asked whether the company's control structure could change if the waiver failed. Yes. Then you have 2 problems. The first is whether the document is invalid. The second is whether anyone inside the company concealed a control risk from the board. Petra is not inside the company. Does she attend privilege meetings? Yes. Does she direct employees? Apparently. Then your organization chart is less relevant than her access. The next morning, Marcus requested system logs for the prenup file. The logs showed that Dex Fontaine had downloaded it at Petra's request 8 months earlier. Dex worked for the founder's former law firm, not Harlow's current outside counsel, which meant Petra had reached backward into a confidential archive rather than obtaining the agreement through a formal corporate channel. Marcus called Dex's supervising partner. The partner initially described the access as part of a legitimate client inquiry. Which client? Marcus asked. Harlow Capital. Who authorized it? I would need to review. Review before you answer again. By noon, the partner called back with independent counsel on the line. No board officer had authorized Petra's request. Dex had assumed Petra represented Cade personally because she knew the document's date, section structure, and storage reference. Petra had obtained those details from an index used during an earlier lender review. Dex agreed to preserve his communications. He did not yet agree to provide them. That changed after Inara's litigation hold notice arrived. Dex read the warning that destruction or alteration of records could result in sanctions. He then looked at the messages in which Petra had told him the founder family had approved access. He called his own attorney. By Saturday morning, his attorney contacted Gideon and offered voluntary production in exchange for written confirmation that Marcus was not asking Dex to waive his rights. The messages did not show a cinematic conspiracy. They showed something more believable and therefore more damaging, small breaches of protocol justified by urgency status, and the assumption that someone else had verified what no one had verified. Petra asked for the prenup. Dex trusted her title. Foster's junior team trusted her access to Cade. The associate trusted her statement that separate signature collection had been arranged. The records department trusted the label final executed. Cade trusted the summary placed in front of him. Each person performed one incomplete step. Together, they created a document powerful enough to influence a divorce and defective enough to collapse under the first serious review. Marcus had spent 30 years watching financial disasters form that way. Fraud was sometimes a single deliberate lie. More often, it was a chain of people deciding that verification belonged to someone else. He drove to Greenwich on Thursday with the signature page in his file because he wanted to see Cade's face before deciding how much Cade knew. When Cade appeared genuinely confused by Sloan's hospitalization dates, Marcus felt no relief. Ignorance did not absolve a chief executive who had approved an agreement affecting corporate control. merely changed the category of failure. After leaving the house, Marcus sat in his car for 7 minutes. He remembered Sloan at a company dinner 6 years earlier, asking why management's capital allocation model assumed employees would absorb all restructuring costs while executives retained transaction bonuses. No spouse at a ceremonial dinner was expected to ask that question. Cade's father had laughed. Kate had looked proud. Marcus had liked her immediately. Now he wondered how the company had moved from depending on Sloane's judgment to allowing documents bearing her name to be processed without her presence. He called Gideon again. "I want an independent analysis before this reaches the board." "Whose side are you on?" asked Gideon. "The company's." That answer usually means the person has not decided. Marcus looked through the windshield at his own dark house. "I am on the side of the record being true." "That is a better answer." The baby changed the timeline. That Thursday evening, Sloane attended her 35th week checkup. The first blood pressure reading was high. The second was higher. Her obstetrician sat down rather than continuing to stand. "I want twice-weekly monitoring," she said. "There are signs of preeclampsia. They are not severe yet, but I don't want you alone if you develop a headache, visual changes, upper abdominal pain, bleeding, or regular contractions." Sloane wrote every instruction in a small notebook. "Could this move the delivery earlier?" "Yes." "How much earlier?" "I can't predict that." In the elevator, Sloane called Anara. "The doctor may move the birth forward. Does she think you're in immediate danger?" "No, but the timeline is no longer reliable." "Then we file the preservation notices tomorrow." "For the legal files?" "For every email, text, calendar entry, and access log connected to the amendment." Sloane looked at her reflection in the elevator doors. The woman looking back at her appeared calm. She had become very good at looking calm during moments that altered the shape of her life. "Do it," she said. The next morning, Anara's firm sent litigation hold notices to Cade's attorneys, the escrow trustee, Harlow Capital's general counsel, and the outside firm that had handled the postnuptial amendment. The notices did not accuse anyone of fraud. They simply warned that every record connected to drafting, access, execution, notarization, and distribution had to be preserved. At 11:18, a 27-year-old junior associate named Dex Fontaine read the notice twice and called his own attorney. By noon, Marcus Lyle had requested the original paper file from outside counsel. By 3, Petra Voss had learned that the file was being reviewed. And by 4, she had begun contacting independent board members about a leadership discussion Cade had never authorized. The week the clock shortened, the twice-weekly monitoring changed the shape of Sloane's days. On Monday and Thursday mornings, she sat beneath fluorescent lights while a monitor recorded Eleanor's heartbeat and another cuff tightened around her arm every 15 minutes. The nurses asked about headaches, vision changes, swelling, nausea, pain beneath her ribs, and whether the baby's movements had changed. Sloane answered precisely. She had always believed precision created control. Pregnancy had taught her that precision sometimes only gave fear a schedule. At the first appointment, Eleanor's heart rate dipped for 11 seconds when Sloane shifted onto her back. The nurse calmly repositioned her. The rhythm recovered. The event was medically ordinary. Sloane cried in the restroom afterward with both hands pressed against the sink. She did not cry because she believed the baby was dying. She cried because for 11 seconds, a line on a screen had become the only fact in the world. Anara waited outside without asking whether Sloane wanted comfort. When Sloane emerged, Anara handed her a bottle of water and said, "The car is downstairs." They rode home in silence. At the apartment, Anara removed the legal pad from her bag but did not open it. "You are allowed to stop preparing," she said. "For how long?" "As long as you need." "I don't know how to do that." "I know." Sloane sat in the unfinished second bedroom beside the bassinet. "If she comes before he files." "He has already filed." "If she comes before we are ready." "We are legally ready." "I am not talking about legally." Anara sat in the chair across from her. That was the first time Sloane described the 11-week loss in detail. She described waking in the hospital after the procedure and seeing Cade by the window answering messages. She described the tea left downstairs, the silence the next morning, and the way every person around them accepted Cade's return to work as strength. "I thought being calm would make it easier for him to come back to the subject," Sloane said. "Instead, calm made it possible for him never to return." "You were grieving too. I know that now. Did anyone ask what you needed?" Sloane considered it. "My mother did. I told her I was fine." Anara's expression contained no judgment. "Perhaps the problem is not only that people failed to ask." "No," Sloane said. "Sometimes I made silence easier for them." That recognition did not transform her into a different person. The next morning, she still made lists. She still organized medical records by date and placed emergency numbers beside the door. But she called her mother. She did not tell her about Section 14's Petra or the investigation. She simply said the pregnancy had become more complicated and she was afraid. Her mother was silent for several seconds. Do you want me to come? Yes, it was one of the hardest words Sloane had spoken all month. Her mother arrived from Philadelphia on Saturday with a suitcase, soup packed in glass containers, and no question Sloane was not ready to answer. She slept on the sofa because the second bedroom belonged to the baby now. Sunday afternoon, Cade called for the first time since the filing. Sloane watched his name appear on the screen. Anara had said she could answer medical calls but should avoid discussing the case without counsel. Sloane stepped into the bedroom and closed the door. "How is the baby?" Cade asked. The question came late enough to hurt and sincerely enough to complicate the hurt. "She is stable. I am being monitored for preeclampsia." Foster mentioned medical records in the filing response. Of course, Foster had told him before Cade asked her. "What does stable mean?" "It means the doctors are watching us. Do you need anything?" The old version of Sloane wanted to answer no automatically. Instead, she said, "I needed you in October." Cade did not respond immediately. "I thought you told me to stay in San Francisco. I told you the baby was alive. Petra told you to stay." The silence changed. "How do you know Petra told me?" "Because the message she sent with the hospital flowers used the same word you used afterward. Stability. That does not prove—" "I am not trying the case with you, Cade. You asked what I needed." "I answered," he exhaled. "Can I come to the next appointment?" "No." "Why?" "Because your presence would make the appointment about our marriage. I need it to be about the baby." He accepted the boundary badly but quietly. "All right." Before ending the call, he said, "Tell me if anything changes. I will tell you if there is an emergency." "That is not the same thing." "No," Sloane said. "It isn't." That night, Eleanor moved less than usual. Sloane drank cold water, lay on her left side, and counted movements the way the nurse had instructed. Her mother sat on the edge of the bed without speaking. At movement number 10, Sloane closed her eyes. "Do you want me to stay in here?" her mother asked. "Yes." Another difficult word. Another one she survived. 3 days later, the blood pressure reading at the clinic rose again. The obstetrician discussed steroid injections for the baby's lungs, warning signs that would require immediate admission, and the possibility that delivery might occur before 37 weeks. Sloane received the first injection that afternoon. The second came 24 hours later. By Saturday evening, the hospital bag stood beside the apartment door. The leather portfolio was inside. Not because Sloane valued the case over the birth, but because Anara had instructed her not to leave original documents in an apartment Cade's lawyers might eventually seek access to. Sloane's mother returned briefly to Philadelphia to collect medication and clothes for a longer stay. Anara offered to sleep on the sofa. Sloane refused. "I am pregnant, not incapable. Those are not the only reasons people should avoid being alone. I will call if anything changes." Anara studied her. "You use competence the way other people use locked doors. Locked doors are useful, until there is a fire." Sloane almost smiled. "Go home, Anara." At 3:17 Sunday morning, the first decisive contraction woke her. By the third, she understood the fire had arrived. The night Eleanor arrived, the baby came on Sunday, 5 weeks ahead of schedule. At 3:17 in the morning, Sloane woke with a pain that felt different from the contractions she had been cataloging for 2 weeks. This was sharper, more decisive. She timed the next one, then the next. When they settled into a pattern, she called her driver, her obstetrician, and Anara in that order. Anara answered on the second ring. "I'm going in," Sloane said. Now, I'll meet you there. That isn't necessary." "I know." Anara ended the call before Sloane could object again. New York Presbyterian received her at 4 in the morning. Her blood pressure had crossed the line her obstetrician had warned about. Labor was progressing, and the medical team decided it was safer to manage the delivery than attempt to stop it. A nurse named Delia helped Sloane change, place the monitors, and explained each sound in the room without speaking to her as though fear had made her stupid. Anara arrived at 4:40 carrying 2 coffees from a 24-hour diner. She sat by the window with her legal pad closed. They did not discuss Cade. They discussed Anara's daughter at NYU, a restaurant on Amsterdam Avenue, and whether hospital pillows had been designed by someone who hated the human spine. The ordinary conversation held the room together. At 11:52 Sunday morning, Sloane's daughter was born. 5 pounds, 9 ounces, small but healthy. Her cry was immediate, indignant, and surprisingly forceful. The nurse placed her on Sloane's chest. Sloane looked down at the dark hair, the straight nose, the fingers closing reflexively against her skin. Every calculation she had made for 31 days became secondary. The child was not a clause. She was not leverage. She was not the completion of a plan. She was a person who had entered the world furious about the lighting and determined to make herself heard. "There you are," Sloane whispered. She named her Eleanor Grace Harlow. Eleanor had been her grandmother's name. Grace was the quality Sloane's mother believed people were born with and spent their lives learning not to waste. At 12:08, with Sloane's permission, Anara stepped into the corridor. She called her filing clerk and authorized 3 documents that had been prepared in advance. A notice that Kate Harlow's biological child had been born alive while his petition for dissolution remained pending. A motion declaring the postnuptial waiver invalid because Sloan had never signed it, never received independent counsel for it, and never submitted it to the escrow trustee. And a formal demand that the trustee implement Section 14C, transferring 11% of Harlow Capital Holdings to Sloan and 11% into a custodial trust for Eleanor. The filings reached Foster's office at 12:14. Cade saw the subject line at 12:17 while standing at the kitchen island in Greenwich. Harlow v. Harlow notice of live birth and demand for escrow transfer. He called Foster immediately. Foster had already opened the attachments. "What am I reading?" Cade asked. Foster was silent for 4 seconds. "The original prenup contains a founder's continuity covenant tied to a voting share escrow. I know what the prenup contains. The amendment waived it." That was the intended effect. Intended? "The copy in our file is not signed by Sloan. It also lacks the independent counsel certificate and trustee acceptance required by Section 14C. Cade gripped the edge of the island. "You told me it was complete." "I told you I had been informed it was complete." "By whom?" Foster did not answer quickly enough. "By whom?" Cade repeated. "Petra coordinated the execution process with the junior team while you were traveling." The kitchen seemed to contract around him. "What happens now?" "If the court agrees the waiver is invalid, and I see no credible argument that it is valid, the filing you made while Sloan was pregnant satisfied the first condition. Eleanor's live birth before final judgment satisfied the second, and the shares. The escrow trustee will be required to transfer them." "How many?" 22% in total." Cade looked through the windows toward the garden and understood that he had not merely failed to close a loophole. He had performed the exact act that opened it, Petra's real investment. Petra came downstairs 20 minutes later in bare feet and a cashmere sweater. She found Cade standing at the island with his untouched coffee. "What happened?" he told her. Her expression changed only once. A brief recalculation she covered almost immediately. "This is an execution defect," she said. "Foster needs to establish substantial compliance. The waiver was drafted, notarized, and circulated. We argue the missing signature was clerical. A missing signature is not clerical. Then we show intent." "Whose intent?" "Yours. The firm's. The purpose of the amendment was clear. Sloan's intent is the only one that matters." Petra stopped. Cade had never spoken to her in that tone. He turned his phone toward her. On the screen was an email Foster had forwarded from September. Petra's name appeared above a message discussing Section 14 and the urgency of obtaining a waiver before the child's birth. "You knew about the clause before I told you," Cade said. "I was advising the company. You were not retained to advise on my marriage. The clause affected corporate control. You accessed my prenup. I was given relevant information by counsel before we were together." Petra's silence answered more clearly than a denial would have. Cade looked at her and saw the past 8 months rearrange themselves. The strategic questions. The sympathy offered after late meetings. The suggestion that Sloan's pregnancy made her unstable. The insistence that the amendment be completed while he was traveling. The public photographs. The advisory board proposal. Petra had not entered his life without feeling. That would have been too simple. But feeling had never been the only reason she stayed. "Did you tell me Sloan wanted me to remain in San Francisco when she was hospitalized?" he asked. Petra's jaw tightened. She said, "The baby was fine. That is not what I asked. You were closing a transaction and you made the decision for me. I protected your priorities." Cade understood then what Petra believed he was. Not a man she loved. An asset whose priorities could be arranged. His phone rang. "Marcus Lyle." Cade answered. "I have the original execution file," Marcus said. "You need to hear what is in it before you speak to anyone else." The man who checked the details. Later that Sunday, Marcus sat in a conference room on Park Avenue with Gideon Park, an attorney specializing in corporate trusts and contested instruments. On the table lay the original postnuptial file. The paper signature page was blank. The notary block had been completed anyway. Attached to the file was an internal routing sheet showing that a junior associate had been instructed to obtain Sloan's signature at the hospital on October 2nd. The associate's handwritten note stated, "Client not present." Petra Voss advised separate execution would be confirmed. Notary page completed pending signature. There was no later signature. There was no separate execution. There was only a scanned document relabeled as complete 3 days later. Dex Fontaine, after consulting his attorney, had voluntarily provided the preserved email chain. The messages showed Petra requesting the prenup from a paralegal at Cade's father's former law firm 8 months earlier. She described the request as part of a confidential governance review, although no such review had been authorized. A second chain showed her pressing Foster's junior team to finish the waiver while Sloan was hospitalized. A third showed Petra asking for the document to be indexed as executed before the trustee had acknowledged it. Marcus read the emails twice. "She knew the clause could change control," he said. Gideon nodded. She also knew Cade filing first was part of the trigger. Then why encourage the divorce before the baby was born? Because she believed the waiver was valid. Once the clause was neutralized, a public divorce weakened Cade with the board. She could present herself as the person stabilizing him and the company. Marcus looked at the blank signature line. She built the entire strategy on a document no one checked. Powerful people often do, Gideon said. They mistake circulation for execution. Marcus gathered the papers. Petra has called 3 independent directors to the building at 4:30. Does Cade know? No. What is she calling the meeting? An emergency leadership discussion. Gideon closed the file. Then she intends to use the activated clause against him. Marcus stood. She will not get the chance. The hospital door. Cade drove to New York Presbyterian that afternoon. Foster had advised him not to contact Sloan without counsel present. Cade ignored the advice. He was not going to discuss settlement terms. He was going because, during Petra's rapid explanation of how to fight the transfer, she had never asked whether the baby was healthy. She had not asked her name. She had not paused to register that Cade's daughter had entered the world that morning. He had registered it late, but he had registered it. At the labor and delivery floor, the nurse checked his name and called Sloan's room. Cade waited in the corridor with his coat still on. The nurse returned. Mrs. Harlow will see you. He opened the door to room 14. Sloan sat upright in the bed with the baby in her arms. The afternoon light fell across her face. She looked exhausted, pale, and more fully herself than he had seen her in years. There was no accommodation in her expression, no adjustment for his mood, no silent effort to make his arrival easier. She did not need him to complete the room. That was what stopped him. Eleanor slept against Sloan's chest, dark-haired and serious even in sleep. Cade remained in the doorway until his hesitation became visible. Sloan did not rescue him from it. Eventually, he entered and pulled a chair beside the bed. He looked at his daughter for the first time. Her hand rested against the fabric of Sloan's gown. Her fingers opened and closed without purpose, testing the world. What did you name her? He asked. Eleanor Grace, my grandmother? Mine. He nodded. She's healthy? Yes. Early but healthy. The relief that moved across his face was real. Sloan allowed herself to recognize it without mistaking it for absolution. After several minutes, she reached for the leather portfolio on the bedside table. Cade looked at it as if he had seen it in the lobby and failed to understand what it contained. Sloan opened the tabs. The petition you filed satisfied the first condition, she said. You initiated the divorce while I was pregnant. She placed the original agreement on the bed. Eleanor's birth satisfied the second condition. She was born alive before the divorce became final. She placed the amendment beside it. This was supposed to waive the transfer. Cade stared at the empty line. You never signed. No. Did they ever bring it to you? No. The notary says. The notary certifies a signature that does not exist. He looked at the date, October 2nd. I was in this hospital from September 30th through October 6th. Cade's face tightened. Why didn't you tell me when you found it? Because you would have withdrawn the petition or corrected the waiver. You wanted me to file. I needed you to make the choice you were already preparing to make. The lobby witnesses, was that planned? No. The filing was the strategy. The witnesses were insurance against you, later calling this mutual. He absorbed that. You knew for 31 days. Yes. And you said nothing. I spent 5 years telling you things you preferred not to hear. Her voice remained quiet. This time, I let your own certainty speak for you. Cade looked down at Eleanor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then his phone rang. Petra. He declined it. 2 minutes later, Foster called. Cade stepped into the corridor. When he returned, his expression had changed. Petra is at Harlow Capital, he said. She called an emergency board meeting without authorization. Sloan closed the portfolio. Anara knew she contacted 3 directors on Friday. She's presenting a leadership review. She intends to argue that your divorce and the transfer make you unstable. Cade stared at her. You knew that too? We suspected. We did not have proof of how far she had gone. Marcus does, Cade said. Sloan looked at Eleanor. Then let Marcus finish it. The meeting Petra never controlled. Marcus arrived at Harlow Capital at 3:45. He met Warren Cresswell and the other 2 independent directors separately before Petra's proposed gathering. Each received the same single-page chronology. 8 months earlier, Petra obtained confidential information from a paralegal at the founder's former law firm. 6 months earlier, Petra began advocating for an expanded advisory board. 2 months earlier, she pushed for a waiver of Section 14C. October 2nd, the waiver was notarized while Sloan was hospitalized and absent. 3 days later, the unsigned document was mislabeled as executed. Tuesday, Cade filed for divorce while Sloan was pregnant. Sunday, Eleanor was born alive, triggering the transfer. Friday through Sunday, Petra contacted directors and offered an emergency governance solution that included a formal role for herself. Attached were the preserved emails and the junior associate's signed statement. Warren Cresswell read the chronology twice. She knew the filing would trigger the clause, he said. She believed the waiver had neutralized it, Marcus replied. That allowed her to use the divorce to weaken Cade without risking the shares. When the waiver failed, she moved faster and tried to turn the resulting crisis into an argument for replacing his authority with hers. Warren set down the page. Where is Cade? At the hospital with his wife and daughter. That answer mattered more than Marcus expected. Warren looked toward the boardroom. Cancel the gathering. It was never authorized. Then make sure no one mistakes it for a meeting. At 4:28, Petra entered the same marble lobby where Sloan had received the cheap envelope. She found Foster waiting near security. Beside him stood two outside investigators retained by the board's audit committee to preserve records and interview those involved in the unauthorized access to the Harlow prenup. Warren's assistant approached Petra first. The directors will not be meeting with you today. Petra looked toward the elevators. They are already here. They have reviewed the materials Marcus Lyle provided. For the first time since entering the building, Petra's composure required effort. Foster held out a formal notice. This directs you to preserve all communications devices and files related to the Harlow agreements, the escrow covenant, and your board contacts. Harlow Capital is suspending your advisory access pending investigation. Petra did not take the paper immediately. You are allowing a domestic dispute to dictate corporate governance. No, Foster said. We are investigating whether an outside advisor used confidential client material to manufacture a governance crisis and then offered herself as the solution. The security guard watched without appearing to watch. Petra accepted the notice. She did not make a scene. She declined an immediate interview, requested counsel, and left the building with her posture intact. Halfway down 6th Avenue, she understood that posture was the only thing she still controlled. She had mistaken Sloane's silence for surrender. She had mistaken Cade's vanity for permanent obedience. Most of all, she had mistaken an unfinished document for power, the hours between consequence and regret. After Marcus ended Petra's meeting, Cade remained in the hospital corridor with Foster on the phone. Foster's voice had lost the measured confidence Cade had relied on for years. The audit committee has preserved Petra's access logs. The outside firm is reviewing every communication connected to the amendment. You should assume the board will ask when you first learned of Section 14A, who authorized Petra and why a marital waiver affecting 22% of voting control was not independently verified. I approved the amendment. That is not the same as authorizing her methods. It will be to the board. Foster did not disagree. What did you know? Cade asked. I knew Petra was assisting with coordination. I did not know she obtained the original prenup outside formal channels. I did not inspect the final signature page personally. Neither did I. You are the client. I am the chief executive of the company affected by it. Yes, the single word carried more judgment than Foster would ordinarily risk. Cade ended the call and remained beside a window overlooking the East River. For most of his adult life, he had treated responsibility as a hierarchy. The person with the highest title made the final decision. Everyone below carried the failure of execution. It was the structure his father had used, the structure Cade had resented, and the structure he had reproduced without recognizing it. He had approved the waiver because Petra said it was necessary. He had allowed Foster's team to process it because legal details felt beneath the strategic level where Cade believed he belonged. He had remained in San Francisco because Petra said Sloan was stable. He had filed because the amendment was complete. At every stage, Cade possessed enough authority to choose and enough distance to blame someone else for the facts on which he chose. Through the closed door of room 14, he heard Eleanor cry. The sound was thin, furious, and alive. Cade put his hand against the wall. He did not enter immediately. The nurse came from the room carrying an empty tray. Is she all right? He asked. The baby is hungry. That is generally considered a healthy complaint. Cade nodded. The nurse studied him with the professional neutrality of someone who had already received enough information to form a personal opinion. Mrs. Harlow needs rest, she said. Whatever happened before today, do not make her manage it for you in there. I won't. It was an easy promise to make and a difficult one to understand. When Cade returned, Sloan was feeding Eleanor beneath a light blanket. He looked away until Sloan told him he could sit. For 20 minutes, no one discussed shares, petitions, or Petra. Cade watched Eleanor's small jaw move, watched Sloan adjust her with the uncertain care of a new mother who had already learned more in 6 hours than he had allowed himself to learn in months. Did you buy anything for her? Sloan asked. The question surprised him. A crib, for Greenwich. Did you choose it? Petra sent options. Sloan's face did not change. Cade heard the answer as she heard it. No, he said. I didn't choose it. He remembered approving a nursery budget between meetings without looking at the furniture. He had treated preparation for his daughter as another delegated work stream. What does she need now? Nothing you can order. The answer was not intended as punishment. That made it worse. Eleanor finished feeding and began to fuss. Sloane lifted her carefully, but exhaustion made her arms tremble. Cade stood halfway and stopped. "May I?" Sloane looked at him for several seconds. Then she placed Eleanor in his arms. The baby weighed almost nothing compared with the fear of dropping her. Cade held her too rigidly. "Support her neck," Sloane said. He adjusted his hand, not that high. He tried again. Eleanor opened her eyes once, unfocused and dark, then closed them against his shirt. Cade felt her breathing. It was the first physical fact of his daughter he had allowed himself to receive. Not an ultrasound image forwarded between calls. Not a due date placed on a calendar. Not a clause in a family agreement. A body. A weight. A life depending on the steadiness of his hands. His eyes filled before he could prevent it. Sloane saw. She did not comfort him. She also did not take Eleanor away. For several minutes, Cade stood beside the hospital bed, holding the child whose existence had altered the company he inherited and exposed the man he had become. He understood that regret was not repair. It was only the first accurate measurement of damage. What Cade finally said back in room 14, winter darkness settled beyond the glass. Eleanor slept in the clear bassinet beside Sloane's bed. Cade remained in the chair after Foster confirmed that Petra's meeting had collapsed. For the first time in years, there was nothing left for him to manage. No public statement, no deal structure, no version of events that made him appear deliberate. Sloane looked at him. "I need to say this once," she said. "I loved you before the company went public. Before the penthouse. Before every room began agreeing with you." He lowered his eyes. "I loved the man who was afraid he would never be good enough. I thought if I gave him enough patience, he would eventually stop being afraid." She paused. "Instead, you learned to treat patience as proof that there would be no consequence." Cade looked at Eleanor. "I knew you were smarter than me," he said. Sloane waited. "Not in every way. In the ways that exposed me. You could see what people wanted before I could. You understood the cost of decisions I only understood as opportunities." He swallowed. "I created distance because being admired by Petra was easier than being known by you." "That explains it," Sloane said. "It does not excuse it." "I know." It was the first apology he offered without attaching strategy to it. Sloane did not forgive him in the hospital room. She did not need to punish him either. The documents had already done what documents were supposed to do. Place facts where feeling could no longer rearrange them. Cade stood to leave. At the door, he looked back at Eleanor. "May I come tomorrow?" "No." He accepted the answer. "When?" "I will call you when we are home and settled." He nodded. Then he left without asking where home was. That was the first correct decision he made all day. The transfer 17 days after Eleanor's birth, the escrow trustee sent formal acknowledgement to Inara's office. The letter confirmed that Section 14S had been triggered. 11% of Harlow Capital Holdings would vest in Sloane Morgan Harlow. 11% would transfer into a custodial trust for Eleanor Grace Harlow, with independent management until adulthood. Together, the shares represented 22% of the holding company's voting interest. They did not make Sloane the owner of Cade's empire. They made her impossible to erase from its governance. Sloane read the letter on her phone while Eleanor slept against her chest in the nursing chair of the West 81st Street apartment. She expected triumph. What she felt was relief, the closing of something that had remained open too long. At 9, she called Inara. "I want independent representation at every holding company meeting affecting the escrow shares," Sloane said. "I already drafted the notice. I do not want an unrestricted board seat, I know. Only trust, succession, and governance matters. That is what I drafted." Sloane smiled despite herself. "You are irritatingly prepared. It is one of my better qualities." Inara's tone shifted. "Cade's attorneys have proposed a revised dissolution agreement. Primary residence with you, structured parenting time, full child support, recognition of the transfer, an independent advisory seat limited to trust-related governance, financial settlement, fair, more generous than required in 2 areas. Tell Foster you will review it. And custody? Cade can call me himself." Inara was silent for a moment. "I'll tell him." The consequences Petra could not manage. The board's investigation moved faster than the professional disciplinary process, but slower than gossip. Within a week, Harlow Capital terminated Petra's advisory contract and referred the confidential file access to the outside law firms involved. The paralegal who had provided the prenup was dismissed but cooperated fully. Dex Fontaine kept his job after producing the original notes, admitting that he had completed the notary block improperly, and agreeing to testify. The firm placed him under supervision and reported the notarization issue through the required channels. Petra retained counsel. Her lawyer issued a statement describing her actions as an informal governance review misunderstood through the lens of a contentious divorce. No one inside the narrow New York legal world believed the wording had been chosen because the defense was strong. A disciplinary complaint followed. There was no dramatic arrest, no public breakdown, and no final confrontation in a courtroom. There was something more permanent. Doors stopped opening. Calls were not returned. Invitations disappeared. The rooms Petra had spent 8 months entering began to treat her as a risk that had already identified itself. The boardroom on the second Friday in December, Harlow Capital held a properly authorized board meeting. All 7 directors attended. Cade sat at the head of the table beneath the portrait of his father. Marcus Lyle sat to his right. Foster sat against the wall. Anara attended by video for the portion involving the escrow transfer. Cade presented the facts himself. He described the original continuity covenant, the invalid waiver, Eleanor's birth, and the resulting transfer. He did not call the clause unfair. He did not describe Sloan as opportunistic. He did not hide behind Foster. When he finished, Warren Cresswell spoke. "I want the record to reflect that the covenant is functioning as the founder intended," Warren said. "A child, born within the marriage, is not a threat to this company. A leader treating his family as a liability would be the threat." He looked directly at Cade. Cade held the look. "My father wrote that provision because he did not trust me to understand that on my own," Cade said. No one contradicted him. The board approved new controls. No marital waiver affecting company ownership could be handled by in-house personnel. Each spouse required independent counsel. Original signatures had to be verified by the trustee. No outside advisor could access family governance documents without written board authorization. The reforms passed unanimously. After the meeting, Marcus and Cade entered the elevator together. "Your father explained that clause to me once," Marcus said. Cade looked at him. "He said a man who abandons his family when it becomes inconvenient will eventually do the same to his company." The elevator doors closed. "Did he think I would?" Cade asked. Marcus considered the question. He thought power makes every man capable of it. That answer was harder to dismiss. Sunday at 2:10 days before Christmas, Cade called Sloan. Eleanor was nearly 4 weeks old and had developed a strong preference for being held upright while someone walked in a figure 8 across the living room rug. Sloan was halfway through the pattern when her phone rang. "She sounds unhappy," Cade said after hearing Eleanor's small complaints. "She has opinions. She comes by that honestly." Sloan did not answer. "I would like to see her," he said, "when you are ready. Sunday, 2 o'clock, 2 hours. Thank you." She gave him the address. He did not ask why she lived there. He did not complain that she had kept it private. Before she ended the call, he said her name, Sloan. She waited. "I'm sorry about the lobby." She continued walking the figure 8. "Not because it looked bad," he said. "Because I chose humiliation when honesty would have been enough." Eleanor settled against Sloan's shoulder. "I know," Sloan said. "Is that why you're allowing Sunday?" "No, I'm allowing Sunday because you are her father." The answer was not cruel. It was a boundary stated without decoration. Cade accepted it. The first Sunday, Cade arrived at the West 81st Street apartment at 152 carrying no flowers and no oversized gift. Sloan noticed both absences. He wore jeans, a dark sweater, and an expression that suggested he had prepared for a board interrogation rather than 2 hours with a newborn. At exactly 2, Sloan opened the door. Her mother sat in the kitchen with a book and made no effort to hide that she would remain within hearing distance. Cade accepted the supervision without comment. Eleanor was awake in the bassinet, moving her arms with uncoordinated outrage. "She ate 40 minutes ago," Sloan said. "Her diaper is clean. She may sleep, or she may spend the entire visit objecting to existence. What should I do if she cries?" "First, do not assume crying means you have failed." Cade looked at her. The sentence applied to more than the baby. Neither of them acknowledged it. Sloan showed him how to lift Eleanor, how to support her head, and how to settle her against his chest. Cade listened without interrupting. When Eleanor began crying 3 minutes later, his body tightened. "Walk," Sloan said. He walked in a straight line toward the window. "She prefers a figure 8. Why? She has declined to provide supporting analysis." For the first time since the hospital, Cade laughed. The sound startled all 3 adults. He began the figure 8. At first, he counted the turns under his breath as though repetition could be mastered through metrics. After several minutes, Eleanor quieted. Cade looked down at her with visible disbelief. "I did that. You participated," Sloan corrected. She also became tired. He nodded, accepting the reduction. The visit contained no dramatic reconciliation. Cade changed a diaper badly, fastened the new one backward, and started again. He warmed a bottle under water that was too hot until Sloan stopped him. He asked whether the faint mark near Eleanor's wrist was normal. He checked her breathing twice while she slept. At 3:40, Sloan told him the visit would end in 20 minutes. His face closed briefly. Then he looked at the clock and said, "All right." Before leaving, he placed Eleanor in the bassinet rather than using the handoff to move closer to Sloan. At the door, he asked, "Same time next week?" "If this week remains stable, I will keep it stable. You control your conduct, not the week." He absorbed the correction. "I will be here if you confirm." After he left, Sloan's mother closed her book. "How was it?" Sloan looked at Eleanor asleep in the bassinet. "Not enough to change the past. That was not what I asked." Sloan considered the 2 hours honestly. It was a beginning. The following Sundays were similar. Kate arrived early and waited outside until 2. He learned the figure 8 without counting. He learned that Eleanor preferred the left shoulder after feeding and disliked cold wipes with a grievance far larger than her body. He did not discuss the settlement during visits. He did not ask Sloane to reassure him that he was improving. Once, during the 5th visit, Eleanor fell asleep against him, and Cade remained motionless for 30 minutes because he feared waking her. Sloane watched from the kitchen doorway. There had been a time when that image would have tempted her to imagine the family repaired. Now she understood that tenderness in one moment did not erase abandonment in another. Cade could become a loving father without becoming her husband again. Allowing the first did not require risking herself on the second. That knowledge felt less like bitterness than freedom. The dissolution agreement, was finalized during the 2nd week of January. 4 rounds of negotiation produced terms neither sentimental nor punitive. Sloane received primary residential custody. Cade received structured parenting time that could expand as Eleanor grew and as he demonstrated consistency. Both parents shared legal decision-making, with a neutral mediator required before either could bring non-emergency disputes to court. The 22% transfer remained untouched because it did not belong to the marital settlement. It arose from the escrow covenant. Sloane accepted an advisory role limited to trust, succession, and governance matters. She refused a broader seat. "I am not replacing Petra," she told Inara. "I am protecting Eleanor." The financial settlement gave Sloane independence without tying her future to Cade's approval. On the morning the agreement was signed, Inara took Sloane to the restaurant on Amsterdam Avenue they had discussed in the hospital. Eleanor slept in a carrier against Sloane's chest. They ordered breakfast, disagreed about a film, and spoke about Inara's daughter's urban planning thesis. Only after the plates were cleared did Inara mention the case. "The board adopted the amendment protocol yesterday," she said. "Independent counsel, trustee verification, no internal handling." Good. The same word Inara had used when KT filed. It did not mean victory. It meant the structure now matched the truth. What remained, Sloane walked home through Central Park beneath a clear January sky. The trees were bare, the reservoir dark beneath the winter light, and the city rose beyond the branches without caring who had won what. Eleanor slept against her sternum with the heavy trust of a child who did not yet know that adults could fail one another. Sloane stopped near the water. For 5 years, she had mistaken endurance for loyalty. Cade had mistaken her patience for permission. Petra had mistaken her silence for defeat. They had all been wrong in different ways. Sloane placed one hand over Eleanor's back and felt the steady rhythm of her breathing. The shares mattered. The legal victory mattered. The board seat mattered because it would prevent decisions about Eleanor's future from being made in rooms where Eleanor's existence was treated as a complication. But none of those things was the center of Sloane's life anymore. The center was warm, sleeping, and making a small sound against her coat. On the 42nd floor of Harlow Capital, Cade signed the final governance reforms at his father's desk. He had begun seeing Eleanor every Sunday. He arrived on time. He did not bring gifts large enough to substitute for attention. He learned how to warm a bottle, how to hold her through the hour when she cried without explanation, and how to leave when the agreed visit ended without turning departure into a test of Sloane's mercy. None of it repaired the marriage. That was not the purpose. Some consequences were not obstacles to overcome. They were truths to live inside. Cade looked at the city beyond the glass and understood that becoming a better father would not make him the husband he had failed to be. It would only make him a better father. For the first time, he accepted that something could matter even when it did not restore what he wanted. In the West 81st Street apartment, Sloane removed Eleanor from the carrier and sat in the nursing chair beside the window. Eleanor opened her dark eyes and studied her mother with solemn concentration. Sloane looked back. The room was quiet, not the quiet of surrender, not the quiet of someone waiting to be chosen, the quiet of a life that no longer needed to explain itself. Sloane smiled, and this time there was no one in the room she needed to hide it from.